This was the video I mentioned that I wanted you to hear. Um, this is a 2 hour long video, but I'm only going to play the end of it, like the last 30 minutes, because I feel like what I found was the most compelling information she saved for the end here. Um, so I'm gonna play it and just listen on.
Although your only other choice is to individually and independently get off grid.
And Dave Hodges, freeing America one enslaved mind at a time. It's hard work.
Well, sadly, it is work that, well, I won't go into that. I want to finish the discussion on microgrids because everyone that's listening, the only way you're going to free yourself from the sequestration, the taking of any electricity that you generate via solar panels, because here in California, in January of 2020, all new construction required solar panel deployment. Now, I use the word deployment because this is a military operation. The solar panels, in conjunction with the Tesla or lithium-ion batteries, are weapons. They require a smart meter. The Tesla Powerwall battery system needs to be deployed in the garage. Lithium-ion batteries degrade rapidly over time.
I want to pause right there. There are YouTube videos where you can watch how people make their own solar panels, which in my spare time I've actually tried to make one, just to know if I can. But there are some that will show you how you can make your own and not have to rely upon that the lithium battery that she talks about that's usually stored inside a garage somewhere. There's some where you can just make them and actually put them in like windows or spaces in your doors that have windows in them. For those that live in the hotter states. So there's a way to create electricity without worrying about, relying upon them, being able to circumvent and shut it down whenever they want.
They catch on fire and they're very difficult to put out. Just like the lithium-ion bikes. You don't want to be buying a bicycle because if you watch on YouTube, you see many, a rear end potentially getting blown off or up, whatever you want to call it. So the microgrids are very dangerous. It is a transition to renewable energy only, when in fact the wind and solar are all controlled because of the weather controlling technologies. This is how they're going to bring us down. This is a military operation in confinement of utility use and how they will move and transition people off their lands. This ultimately will be a way in which there are forced relocations into city confinement zones, or death zones, as we call them. So I'll talk further on our next program about microgrids. I want to get into this Rockefeller plan to use bioweapons to impose martial law, one quarantine at a time.
And you think about it, those are those movies from the 80s, right? We just played a clip from it that was it Escape Brooklyn? It might not even that movie because I think Escape Brooklyn was no, it's not that movie. That's not the title. I can't think of it, but it was based out of Brooklyn and them deciding that with after them poisoning the people in Brooklyn, they still weren't leaving, so they were gonna force relocate them, after their quarantine and stuff like that to New Mexico. But I just want to point this out. You as the Indian, you as the Los Indios, God's people, in God's land, or the lost people of God, however you want to use it. Just going back to the Spanish term for it. You as the Indian, having the rights to this land. You tell me, being a United States citizen or being an Indian would prevent you from having to fall into this trap, and then of course through paperwork you need to undo what they've done to you through paperwork, right?
This is a document. It's a scenario planning document, scenarios for the future of technology and international development in 2010. So we're going to go over this now. Listen carefully, because it pertains to what is happening right now to all of us, and you'll have an opportunity to hear what their plans will include so that you can start hardening up around your homes, putting locks on outside structures, because mayhem is going to occur, and it's going to happen rapidly now because we have more and more people unemployed. They're desperate, they're fearful, they have no money, and they can't buy food. And while here in the United States we've been promised a stimulus package, which is highway robbery, of about $1,200 per person, dependent on if you qualify by a number of aspects, that's only going to buy food for a little while. So there will be an injection of buying of food. But what we're also seeing at the same time is the limited food ability by the way food is being distributed in our marketplaces now. We're having to stand in long lines. They're only allowing limited people into a market at a time. They'll only let people in as people exit. We're now seeing where you can only buy maybe two 8-ounce bags of frozen vegetables per family. So we're starting to see rationing developing, just as I saw in Cuba and what has been happening in Venezuela and other places around the world. This is going to certainly become only the amount of food required for our vital needs, which is determined by the 1% of the 1%. We're looking at massive death due to starvation, because there will be many people that won't be able to access food. So our streets are going to become very, very dangerous. But let's go over this document. It is a scenario planning, and it was again done in 2010. I want to remind you that Rockefeller was behind the creation of the educational system. Just to talk about what John D. Rockefeller created the General Education Board in 1903 to dispense the Rockefeller funds to education. And the quote back then was, "I don't want a nation of thinkers. I want a nation of workers." Well, we can replace that by slaves. And now we're being harvested. Rockefeller also deceived us with the illusion that our petroleum came from fossil fuels. The Rockefeller Foundation and the philanthropies are deadly instruments of death. And sadly, we have been misinformed what philanthropies are. We always think that that is generosity from corporations and how they're giving back. It's most important to understand that philanthropies fund and bring in their designed agendas. In fact, in this document, a number of smaller countries will no longer want to sign into agreements with philanthropies. They are deadly. So, again, a misinterpretation of wording and what these words mean. So here are some excerpts out of that document. They tell us...
Deborah, just name the document again just before you start. Name the document.
Yes, it's called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development, 2010. And you can find that on StopTheCrime.net. And it should be under Hot Topics and a few other places. Here are some excerpts. An economically depressed world in which individuals and communities develop localized makeshift solutions to a growing set of ongoing problems. And they say they worked on this project, this scenario planning, for over a year, and they utilized people of all intel and NGOs and thought leaders to put this together. This is a scenario planning. It is a component of the strategy for scenario planning, which they call a process of creating narratives about the future based on factors likely to affect particular challenges and opportunities. And the Rockefellers went on to say that they believe that the scenario planning has great potential for use in philanthropic work and to identify unique interventions. It is a rehearsal. It is to make future decisions. And they say that scenario planning allows them to achieve impact more effectively. So this is a script that has been thought out very carefully, and they talk about how pandemics would move their socialized agenda and control and bankruptcy of the world forward. So they go on to talk about how the Rockefeller Foundation's use, and they've used people that have had 40-plus year careers in scenario planning. So they're taking the big guns when they formulate this kind of plan to represent the global takedown. And they, again, talk about the power of scenario planning and that it will involve technologies and the range of tools for basic survival, that pumps and basic filtration technologies will not be available in the supply chain, to more advanced innovations, and they talk about how they will be collecting and utilizing data in health informatics and novel building materials with real-time environmental sensing capabilities. So while we're hiding in our houses, I want all of you to keep in mind what's happening to all of the vacated city buildings and infrastructure in your cities, including businesses. Massive real-time sensing capabilities are in full deployment. So they go on to talk about how their scenario planning and that it will have great influence. They have a foundation staff and they have grantees with money and external experts that have contributed to this. And they talk about the uncertainties of a longer list of potential uncertainties, such as social inequities, technology impacts and the use of technologies, and the eliminating of the use of technologies, the economic goals and the deficits planned in the economies, and environmental and political trends. It's a bottom-up, top-down, and they talk about lower levels of adaptive capabilities emerge in the absence of characteristics, and they say that it leaves populations particularly vulnerable to the disruptive effects of unanticipated shocks. I'm going to read that again. We are all being left vulnerable to disruptive effects of unanticipated shocks. And they're utilizing that effect of premeditated weaponized events on all of us, not only through technologies and weapon systems of weather, and using infrastructure as targeting us with the taking down of the levees and the atmospheric rivers that they sit on top of wastewater treatment plants to cause them to overflow, and all the rest of what they're doing. They call that, we must have the ability to be resilient, because this is nature. We are in a new normal, and we can expect hotter and more disruptive climate changes because we have not lowered our greenhouse gas emissions. That is what we are being told in the documents, and in the new Green Deal, there's nothing new about it. It's a very old deal. There's nothing green. It's deadly, and it is by far a deal of death. So the new Green Deal is literally the template with the technology to keep global warming, they tell us, below 1.5 degrees centigrade, or they will crank it up to 2.0 degrees centigrade or more if a nation or state or region is not politically obedient. Now, I hope you're listening to how the use of these technologies are being used on us. If we are not obedient, and if we are not doing as we are commanded to do, we will be attacked, and that is what we're seeing. So the document talks about lockstep, a world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. We're seeing citizen pushback all over the world now, but because of the COVID and the required separation, suddenly the yellow vest pushback, the pushback in Hong Kong, all of the pushback in South America and other countries, we're not hearing about that now because everyone has to social distance. And I can tell you that social distancing and the crime and the penalties if you don't social distance is now going to be tightening up over the next few weeks. But in this document, they say there will be hack attacks. An economically unstable and shock-prone world in which governments weaken, criminals thrive, and dangerous innovations emerge. And then they talk about the smart scramble. These are topics, and we'll get into more detail in a moment, but they say an economically depressed world in which individuals and communities develop localized makeshift solutions to a growing set of problems. I discussed that a moment ago already. But here we go. Each scenario tells a story of how the world will progress over the next 15 to 20 years. Now, again, this was put together in 2019, so the time frame is now through the year 2030. And this is some of the advanced warnings that we can expect coming out of this pandemic. They say there will be a massive evolution in technology and international development by 2030. We all can see that. We know that. And this plan, again, is the use of bioweapons to impose martial law, one quarantine at a time, as I stated. And they say that and this again, now this was put together in 2010. So they're using dates ahead of 2010. So right now they're saying in 2012, the pandemic that the world had been anticipating for years finally hit. Unlike the 2009s, the H1N1, this new influenza strain, was extremely virulent and deadly. Now again, they're talking about the future pandemic that hadn't happened when they wrote this. They go on to say even the most pandemic-prepared nations were quickly overwhelmed when the virus streaked around the world, infecting nearly 2 million% of the global population and killing 8 million in just 7 months. The majority of them healthy, young adults. Again, this was pre-planning. They talk about the pandemic also had a deadly effect on economies. A deadly effect on economies. That is what is happening. International mobility of people and goods screeched to a halt. And I will add, supply lines are being cut right now. Your goods and services will not arrive. Watch Soylent Green and just eliminate the eating of humans with the Soylent Green aspect and look at how that city looks. This is a perfect visualization of how elevators and buildings are not operating and how people are cramming into the stairwells of buildings to get cover because the homeless rates are more than people that live in buildings. So they go on to say that the international mobility of people and goods will screech to a halt. It is debilitating industries like tourism and breaking global supply chains. This is quote, unquote. Even locally, normally, bustling shops and office buildings will sit empty. Well, yes, we're all seeing that happen right now. These empty buildings.
One point there, the obvious situation that 90% of all pharma drugs are made in China, and that supply line has been cut straight away because they shut down the factories in China. And secondly,
That's
it's
correct.
no accident that these 3 years of these idiots on these vaping instruments to give off smoking, that came into the equation, and the vaping industry is owned by the tobacco industry. So those people, if they get the virus there, they're going to be wiped out. Because they've got some...
Again,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, everything is poisoned. Everything that is given to us has a poisonous ramification, including the vaping, as you just pointed out. But they go on, again, to say that we'll see the former bustling buildings and stores and shops all sitting empty, devoid of employees and customers. We're all seeing that now, that the pandemic will blanket the planet. The pandemic has presumably blanketed the planet, and they talk about how there will be a disproportionate number of people that will die. And they say that the virus will spread like wildfire in the absence of official containment protocols. Again, this is out of 2010. They say that in developed countries, containment was a challenge. And they say in the United States, The initial policy, or strongly discouraging citizens from flying, proved deadly in its latency, and that accelerating the spread of the virus, not just within the United States, but across all borders. They say few countries fared better. They go on to talk about the plan analysis for China. They say China in particular. The Chinese government's quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens, as well as sealing off all the borders, saved millions of lives. Well, of course, we don't know that. But stopping the spread of the virus far earlier than other countries and enabling a swifter post-pandemic recovery. Well, we're going to talk about what the post-pandemic recovery looks like here.
You're promoting there is a command economy, but like the Chinese,
Yeah.
that's what.
Yeah, it's totalitarian, which, of course, we don't have. So during the pandemic, they talk about how national leaders around the world will flex their authority and impose airtight rules and regulations, from the mandatory wearing of face masks. Hello, this was in 2010. What is the CDC, a private for-profit business, now coming out and saying? Wear face masks, right? So from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries of communal spaces like train stations, bus stations, supermarkets. And even after the pandemic faded, all of this authoritarian control and oversight will continue. I'll go on. I hear a break coming up.
Okay, and we're back from the break, and we're continuing on with a riveting number of hours with Deborah Tavares. I hope listeners are not taking calls today because there's too much good information to get through here. And it's just, I hope they're taking notes, and they have a lot of homework to do, I tell you. But carry on, Deborah, carry on.
Well, absolutely. Again, I am referring to the document that is called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development by the Rockefeller Foundation out of 2010. And again, this is a scenario advanced planning of what the world would look like should a pandemic travel worldwide expeditiously, and we talked about that. So we're going to continue with this because it is going to reveal some hardening up that all of you need to do, because all of the things that are being advanced through this pre-planning script is what it is occurring now. So they go on to say that during the pandemic, national leaders around the world will vex their authority and impose airtight rules and regulations, from mandatory wearing of face masks. Now, I told you about that a moment ago. And they go on to talk about there will be a firmer grip of power around the world, and that after the pandemic is relaxed, which it really won't be, we're going to be staged into continual pandemics because the climate action plans tell us, as a result of our misbehavior and increasing greenhouse gas emissions and the changing temperatures, pandemics and viruses and other types of diseases, which of course are all bioweapons when you look at the NASA war document, are going to continue and increase. We're promised that, from blue-green toxic algae to heating up the water supply and eliminating the oxygen in the water supply, the oxygen in our air, and now charging us for the use of all natural resources. But here we go back into this document. They say at first, a more controlled world will gain widespread acceptance and approval. And all of us will be willing to give up our sovereignty. We don't have any sovereignty, really. And all of our privacy, which, of course, is pretty much already gone. And in exchange for a greater sense of safety and stability. That we were more tolerant, and we will be even eager for top-down direction and oversight. And national leaders will have more latitude to impose order in the ways they see fit. In developed countries, this heightened oversight will take many forms. Now listen to this. Biometric IDs for all citizens, which is, of course, happening now. They say, for example, and tighter regulation of key industries whose stability was deemed vital to national interest. More authoritarian leadership will work less well, and in some cases tragically, in countries run by irresponsible elites who use their increased power to pursue their own interest at the expense of their citizens. Well, that is the definition of all leadership worldwide anyway, at the expense of all of us. And they tell us that there were other downsides as the rise of nationalism created new hazards. In other words, people wanting to believe in patriotism. Again, read Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. Understand how patriotism was even used to impose the illusion of country support, country by country, when in fact we were sent to wars on behalf of all the bankers. But they go on. In the aftermath of the pandemic, scares and smarter packaging for food and beverages will be applied. Big companies will initiate safer packaging. The cost for foods will skyrocket. And individual products will seek a completely different type of packaging. They talk about how there will be new diagnostics developed to detect communicable diseases, and the application of health screening also will change, and screening will become a prerequisite at many locations before you're able to enter. In fact, I can tell you, when we went to Cuba, they do temperature testing because they've always been afraid of the intentional use of humans bringing in bioweapons to Cuba. Castro and, of course, some of the South American leaders knew that the United States was trying to kill them with cancers and other pathogens. And at the time that this was said, everybody was just told that Castro was a communist. And, of course, that's another conversation. But staying to the document, telepresent technologies, which is what we're seeing now with all the at-home teleconferencing.
We're back with our actor-built friend, and we're back with Deborah for the last, running up to the top of the hour, half an hour, roughly 20-odd minutes.
And I want to really dive in quickly to more of this Rockefeller document, because it does describe how teledistancing through telecommunications and so forth will emerge on a massive basis, and we're now seeing that. They're also talking about how there will be lower bandwidth, and there will become more sophisticated communication systems for populations whose travel is restricted. And they go on to talk about how and of course, less bandwidth means less power, and that's how we're going to drop off with the ability of being able to communicate. We'll be able to communicate within our microgrid areas with a small group of people, but to be able to have a conversation like this where many people can hear will be great.